Picture the sky over central China on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Dozens of aircraft climbing out of dusty airfields at once, engines of every generation howling together, piston props next to jet turbines, next to helicopter rotors. This is not a single Air Force. It is a production line. Somewhere in that noise, a 19-year-old cadet is taking control of an aircraft for the very first time. And 30 years later, that same person might be commanding a squadron of stealth fighters over the East China Sea. Between those two moments sits one of the most extensive and least understood training fleets on the planet. 18 distinct aircraft, spanning 7 decades of design, built for one purpose only: turning ordinary young men and women into the pilots of the People's Liberation Army. Some of these machines you have never heard of. One of them only flew for the first time a few months ago. Others have been quietly working for so long that entire generations of pilots have retired without ever knowing their replacement was already decades overdue. This is that fleet, machine by machine, chapter by chapter, from the slowest biplane on the flight line to the fastest prototype still wearing bare metal primer. Chapter 1. Ab initio, where every pilot begins. Every bomber crew in China's Air Force starts, technically, in a biplane. The Y-5 traces its bloodline to the Soviet Antonov An-2, a design so old it first flew before the Korean War had even ended, and Chinese factories began producing their own version in 1957. Parked next to a modern jet, it looks almost comical, boxy, slow, held aloft by 2 stacked wings instead of 1, with fixed landing gear that seems to belong in a museum. But that simplicity is precisely the point. Trainee bomber crews use the Y-5 purely to build the fundamentals: crew coordination, radio discipline, basic airmanship, learning to read an aircraft's rhythm long before speed ever becomes a factor. It rarely appears in glossy airshow footage, and it almost never makes headlines. Its entire job is to quietly weed out who belongs in a cockpit and who does not, before anyone spends real money finding out the hard way. Instructors watch how a cadet handles the aircraft's slow, forgiving controls, how they communicate under mild stress, how they behave when a routine flight suddenly asks for a quick decision. Fail here, and a career in the air simply ends before it begins. Pass, and the next aircraft waiting is already dramatically less forgiving. Almost 7 decades later, it is still doing exactly that. 1 year after the Y-5 entered service, in 1958, a very different trainer took its first flight, and this one would go on to shape an entire nation's pilots more than any other single aircraft on this list. The Nanchang CJ-6 is, without exaggeration, the machine that built Chinese military aviation from the ground up. Over 2,000 were produced, some counts run past 3,000, and tens of thousands of student pilots have logged their first solo flight sitting in its tandem cockpit. Here is a detail worth knowing. It is often mistaken for a copy of the Soviet Yak-18, but it is not. Chinese engineers looked at the updated Yak-18A, decided it did not fit their needs, and designed the CJ-6 from scratch instead, giving it an aluminum alloy structure in place of the Yak's steel tube frame, and powering it with a locally built radial piston engine that started at 260 horsepower before later versions pushed to 285. Roughly 400 remain active in PLAF basic training regiments today, alongside a smaller Navy fleet of around 3 dozen airframes. Sri Lanka still flies the export version too, under the designation PT-6, though not without cost. The Sri Lankan Air Force grounded its entire fleet in 2023 after a fatal crash. A sober reminder that even a rugged, decades-old design carries real risk when flight hours pile up. It has also, unexpectedly, become something of a cult favorite among private warbird collectors in the West, prized for being cheap, sturdy, and genuinely fun to fly. There is a reason for that reputation. The CJ-6 tolerates mistakes that would end badly in almost anything else: gentle stall characteristics, forgiving spin recovery, controls that telegraph exactly what the aircraft is about to do. For a nation trying to screen enormous numbers of candidates as efficiently as possible, that forgiving nature is not a limitation, it is the entire design philosophy. This one has quietly outlasted almost everything ever built to replace it. Because plenty of aircraft have tried, in 2006, Hongdu partnered with Russia's Yakovlev Design Bureau, the same bureau behind some of Russia's own modern trainers, to build something entirely new. A modern piston trainer with a digital cockpit and an ejection seat, an unusual feature for something meant purely as a basic trainer. The result? The CJ-7, first flew at the end of 2010, unveiled that same year at the Zhuhai Air Show under the nickname Baby Eagle. Powered by a 9-cylinder Vedeneyev radial engine producing 360 horsepower, plans called for the PLAAF to purchase somewhere between 300 and 500 units, enough to finally retire the CJ-6 for good. It never fully happened. Budget priorities shifted. The CJ-6 kept flying, kept training cadets, and the CJ-7 program quietly stalled, proving that sometimes the old workhorse is simply hard to beat. No matter how modern its replacement looks on paper, nobody expected the veteran to win that fight. Chapter 2. Bridging the Gap, from Piston to Jet. There is a brutal performance gap between a propeller trainer that struggles to reach 300 kilometers an hour and a supersonic fighter capable of well over Mach 1. Something has to bridge that gap, and for 3 decades, that something has been the Hongdu JL-8, known internationally as the K-8 Karakoram. The project began in 1986 as a joint venture between Hongdu Aviation and Pakistan's aeronautical complex, with Pakistan funding roughly a quarter of the entire program. An unusually collaborative arrangement for a Chinese military aircraft of that era. It first flew in 1990, entered formal service in 1994, and has since become China's most successful trainer export by a wide margin. With more than 500 airframes built for customers stretching from Pakistan to Egypt, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Namibia. The Egypt deal alone was worth $345 million, covering local production of 80 aircraft to replace their aging L-29 fleet. Inside China, estimates range from roughly 170 to 350 active airframes, still teaching cadets the basics of jet handling, instrument flying, and formation work before they move on to anything faster. One quirk worth knowing: Western engine sanctions forced Hongdu to power many of these jets with Ukrainian AI, 2 5-TLK turbofans, and later a domestic clone called the WS-11, a small mechanical detail carrying enormous geopolitical fingerprints. It even flies with the Red Falcon aerobatic team, painted bright red and yellow, a rare moment where a trainer becomes a genuine crowd pleaser. For a great many foreign air forces, the JL-8 was also their very first taste of Chinese military hardware of any kind, arriving decades before anyone was buying Chinese fighters and quietly opening doors that later, far larger arms deals would walk through. That export success would soon collide with an aging domestic rival. Chapter 3. The Fighter Track, Supersonic Preparation. Few people remember this one, but it quietly trained a generation of Cold War-era Chinese fighter pilots without ever getting much credit for it. The JJ-7, a 2-seat trainer derived from China's domestic version of the MiG-21, entered service in the mid-1980s, and for years served as the sole bridge between basic jets and genuinely supersonic fighters. It shares its airframe and its WP-13 engine with the J-7 fighter it descends from, mechanical flight controls and all, no fly-by-wire assistance whatsoever, which meant pilots learned to fly by feel in the truest sense of the word. Roughly 200 remain nominally in inventory today, though most are steadily being phased out as newer designs finally take over a role the JJ-7 held almost alone for decades. It is a strange kind of retirement. A trainer descended from a fighter that itself began fading from frontline service years ago. kept flying purely because the next generation of jets to replace it simply was not ready in time. Its own successor was, quite literally, built from its bones. That newer design carries a name that sounds almost peaceful for a supersonic jet, the JL-9, sometimes called Mountain Eagle. Developed by Guizhou starting in 2001 and directly evolved from the JJ-7 lineage, its first prototype flew on the 13th of December 2003. The transformation from its ancestor is dramatic. A completely redesigned nose houses an X-band pulse Doppler radar with roughly 30 kilometers of range, replacing the old circular MiG-21 style intake, while the air intakes themselves were relocated to the fuselage sides to make room. Somewhere between 45 and 100 units now serve the PLAAF and Navy. The naval variant is arguably the more interesting story here. Versions like the JL-9G and its later upgrade added wingtip deceleronds specifically to simulate the low-speed, high angle of attack demands of carrier landings, eliminating the need for a drag parachute in the process. In 2024, footage confirmed these jets practicing touch-and-go landings aboard the carriers Liaoning and Shandong. Then, in March of 2025, official PLA media went further, showcasing an upgraded JL-9 fitted with new wingtip split rudders. Technology one military analyst suggested could eventually migrate into future stealth aircraft designs entirely. It is a small reminder that even the least glamorous aircraft in a fleet can end up quietly testing ideas destined for something far more advanced further down the line. Its export cousin took that same airframe somewhere very different. The FTC-2000G, unveiled with its maiden flight in 2018, uses the strengthened, navalized JL-9G airframe combined with a divertless supersonic inlet, the kind of intake design that improves high-speed performance without any heavy moving parts. It carries up to 7 hardpoints and roughly 3,000 kilograms of ordnance, blurring the line between advanced trainer and genuine light combat aircraft. And it is aimed squarely at Air Force's still-flying aging MiG-21 derivatives who need an affordable, modern replacement without breaking their defense budget. Observers have already tipped it as a serious competitor to Pakistan's JF-17 export program, an unusual position for what began life as a humble trainer airframe rather than a purpose-built fighter. Meanwhile, a rival Chinese trainer had already chosen a completely different path. Because if the JL-9 family represents steady evolution, the Hongdu L-15 represents a clean, deliberate break from everything before it. Development traces back to 2005, with the first prototype rolling off the assembly line that September, though engine trouble delayed the true maiden flight until the 13th of March 2006. Domestically, it wears the designation JL-10, and it finally entered PLAF service in late 2017 with the 172nd Brigade based at Kangzhou's Flight Instructor Training Base. This is a twin-engine, genuinely supersonic aircraft, purpose-built to prepare pilots directly for 4th and 5th generation fighters like the J-16 and the J-20. 2 versions were developed side by side, an advanced trainer variant without afterburner, and a lead-in fighter trainer variant that adds it, pushing the aircraft past Mach 1.4 at altitude with a service ceiling above 13,000 meters. Large leading-edge root extensions, borrowed conceptually from the Russian Yak-130, give it exaggerated high angle of attack capability, specifically so it can mimic the extreme maneuvers of the fighters it ultimately feeds into. Roughly 50 are now in PLAAF and Navy service, a number climbing steadily year over year, and the United Arab Emirates has adopted the export version as well. Proof this particular design travels well beyond Chinese borders. Pilots who have flown it describe the transition from the JL-10 into an operational fighter as genuinely smooth, exactly what its designers intended when they chose to chase raw performance instead of simply refining an older airframe one more time. This is the aircraft China's fastest pilots now grow up on. Chapter 4. Bomber Crews. a different kind of discipline. Fighter pilots get most of the attention in any documentary about military aviation, but bomber crews follow an entirely separate training pipeline, and it starts with an aircraft most outsiders have never even heard of. The HYJ-7 is built on the Xi'an Y-7 transport airframe, itself a Chinese development of the Soviet An-24 that took an astonishing 18 years from initial license agreement to a finished production aircraft, finally flying in February 1984. The HYJ-7 variant strips away that transport heritage and adds enhanced navigation equipment along with simulated bombing assistance systems, giving trainee crews their very first taste of multi-engine, multi-crew operations. Before they ever climb aboard an actual bomber, pilots, navigators, and weapons officers train together in the HYJ-7 as a crew, not as individuals, because the entire philosophy behind bomber operations depends on coordination between multiple stations rather than the single pilot instinct fighter training tends to build. Only after that does the real aircraft finally appear. That actual bomber is the Xi'an H-6, and its story runs deeper than almost anything else covered here. It descends directly from the Soviet Tupolev Tu-16 Badger, with license production beginning in the late 1950s, which makes the basic airframe design older than most of the pilots who fly it today. By decades. Dedicated dual-control trainer variants exist specifically to convert already qualified aviators onto the type, because there is simply no substitute for handling the real aircraft's weight, inertia, and sluggish control response in person. Modern H-6K variants run on D30KP2 turbofan engines for a range beyond 6,000 kilometers, while the newer H-6N adds an aerial refueling probe and an enlarged internal weapons bay built for air-launched ballistic missiles, extending its strategic reach considerably further still. Across every current variant combined, roughly 209 H-6 airframes remain active, including dedicated tanker trainer versions like the H-6U and H-6DU, used specifically to teach aerial refueling procedures to crews from other aircraft types entirely. It is a genuinely strange thing to sit with, an aircraft whose bloodline stretches back to the earliest days of the Cold War, still quietly shaping how China trains its newest strategic aviators today. Crews converting onto the type spend weeks simply learning its idiosyncrasies, the long takeoff roll, the deliberate control inputs, the very different rhythm of flying an aircraft built to carry weapons across oceans rather than to dogfight, a rhythm nothing earlier in the pipeline has prepared them for. Few outside China have ever heard this story told properly. Chapter 5. Beyond the Cockpit, Support and Rotary Training. Not every pilot ends up flying a fighter or a bomber, and China's training system reflects that reality through an entire secondary track most documentaries skip over completely. The Xi'an Y-7, beyond its dedicated HYJ-7 bomber variant, also serves in its own right as a multi-crew and navigator trainer, with fewer than 20 examples remaining in service supporting PLAAF and Navy transport and special mission communities. These are the quiet aircraft producing the navigators, flight engineers, and loadmasters, who later go on to crew China's growing fleet of Y-20 heavy transports and KJ-series airborne early warning platforms. None of it looks glamorous from the outside, a slow turboprop circling a training area for hours at a time, but every long-range mission China's Air Force flies today depends on someone who first learned their trade in exactly this unremarkable cockpit. Rotors, not wings, take over from here. Helicopter crews follow a completely separate path altogether. The Harbin Z9, itself derived under license from the French Eurocopter Dauphin, provides basic rotary wing conversion training for new helicopter pilots, teaching hover control and auto-rotation before anything more demanding. Alongside it, Mi-17 series helicopters, acquired in batches from Russia through the 2000s, handle multi-engine and heavy-lift rotary instruction. Despite reliability concerns in harsh environments, that have gradually pushed China toward domestic alternatives instead. The Z-8 and its upgraded Z-18 variant, which entered service in 2018, take on heavier payload training duties, teaching crews to manage the very different handling characteristics of a much larger airframe. The newer Z-20, inducted around 2019 and engineered for genuine high-altitude performance, increasingly anchors the modern conversion pipeline as older Soviet-designed types are slowly retired from frontline instruction. This entire track exists almost exclusively for the Army aviation, search and rescue, and naval helicopter communities, running in parallel to everything happening in fixed-wing training, and rarely overlapping with it at all. A cadet selected for rotary wing duty essentially leaves the fixed-wing pipeline behind entirely after basic screening, following a completely different curriculum with its own instructors, its own airfields, and its own culture, one built around hovering, auto-rotation, and confined area landings rather than speed and altitude. This one gets almost no coverage anywhere, yet it quietly trains the crews behind entire categories of Chinese military aviation that most people never think to ask about. Chapter 6: The Next Generation, Building Tomorrow's Aviators. Everything covered so far already flies operationally, day in and day out. What comes next is still being tested, and the pace of that testing tells its own story about where this whole system is headed. On the 28th of October, 2025, a genuinely new advanced trainer, built by Hongdu, and informally known within observer circles as the JLXX, conducted its maiden flight, photographed still wearing yellow primer coating with absolutely no operational markings applied yet. Rumors preceding that flight described a stretched fuselage, twin-canted vertical fins styled visibly after the J-35 stealth fighter, and carrot-style engine intakes, all pointing toward a single, unmistakable purpose: preparing pilots specifically for China's stealth aircraft, the J-20 and J-35 families, a job no current trainer in the fleet can fully replicate. If the rumors hold up, this single prototype could eventually reshape the entire advanced training tier the same way the JL-10 reshaped it a decade earlier. While one team chased stealth, another quietly went the opposite direction. At almost exactly the same moment, a second and completely different next-generation program has been quietly taking shape elsewhere. Rumored since February 2025 and unofficially referred to as the CJX, or sometimes XJJ, this is a turboprop-powered primary trainer intended to finally retire the veteran CJ6, a machine that has now outlasted one previous attempted replacement already and shows no sign of surrendering easily. A full-scale model was unveiled at the 2025 Dubai Air Show, revealing glass cockpits front and rear, an AI-enhanced individualized training system, 5-blade high-efficiency propellers, and a projected service ceiling near 8,800 meters, with a range past 2,400 kilometers. Hongdu faces real competition here too, from a rival turboprop design under development at Wuhu Zhongke, suggesting China's next basic trainer will not be decided without a genuine fight between manufacturers. Whichever design ultimately wins, the target is the same: a machine capable enough to properly assess a raw cadet's potential, yet still gentle enough to let a promising pilot make mistakes and learn from them, rather than simply washing out early over a controllable error. The most ambitious idea of all has not even flown yet. Naval planners have floated a trainer informally referred to as the JL-15, intended specifically for operations aboard China's new Kato-bar carrier, Fujian, the kind of catapult-launched, arrested recovery carrier that demands an entirely different category of trainer than anything currently flying. A full-scale mock-up was reportedly tested aboard Fujian as early as 2024, well before any actual flying prototype existed, suggesting China's naval aviation planners are already thinking several years past their current JL-9G fleet, sketching out a training pipeline for a carrier program that is itself still finding its feet. It is an almost backward way of building an air arm, designing the classroom before the graduates even exist. Yet, it captures something true about this entire fleet. Nothing here is ever really finished. Every aircraft on this list exists only because something before it eventually stopped being enough. That is, in the end, the real story here. Not any single airframe, but the relentless churn underneath all of them, quietly turning over generation after generation while barely anyone outside the profession ever notices. Put all of it together: the biplane from the 1950s, the piston trainer that refuses to retire, the jets bridging basic flight into supersonic combat, the quiet bomber and helicopter tracks nobody bothers to photograph, and the stealth-ready prototypes that are only months old, and a clear picture finally emerges. This is not a static fleet sitting still on some airfield somewhere. It is a pipeline under constant renovation, expanding and modernizing at almost exactly the same pace as the combat aircraft it ultimately feeds. Every new fighter added to China's front line traces backward, eventually, through this exact chain of aircraft. And as that front line keeps growing year after year, so, inevitably, will the machines built to prepare the people who fly it? Somewhere on an airfield right now, another cadet is climbing into a Y-5 or a CJ-6 for the very first time, with absolutely no idea which of these 18 aircraft will define the rest of their career.